Thank you Paul for coming back. So I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Macklin, who's foundational head of the fairly new School of Geography, 2.5 years old now, University of Lincoln, rapidly growing school, and also he's foundational director of a key research centre in the university called the Lincoln Centre for Water and Planetary Health. No doubt Mark will be alluded to during his keynote presentation. So Mark's had many years in geography and planetary health research all around the world, so I'm sure this is going to be very topical on a wide number of relevant issues. So without further ado, over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Having started, so I didn't expect to clap. I'm not sure how to really follow what I saw this morning, so thank you again for our Polynesian guests. But I have some attachment and some empathy with where they come from. I apologise, I don't normally apologise, there's a flickering in the projector. Hopefully it will keep us going to the end of this session, but we might have to replace it tomorrow. I still have a fractional chair at Massey University in New Zealand since 2002. Our second home is Wanganui, where I still... Wanganui iwi. Third thing is I'm a sea rower, so the scars and blisters on my hands, so I have complete empathy. But I row across the Irish Sea, which is not quite Pacific, but on occasions it can be a little bit challenging. And then last but not least, I have strong affiliations. I'm an adjunct professor at Trobe University at the Centre of Inland. Those of you that came to my inaugural lecture probably about 6 weeks ago, you will recognise some of this material, and hopefully in terms of those that did come to that inaugural lecture, will actually understand perhaps a little bit more the relevance of what I'm going to try and say today. I'll start with a bit of context, and this is a personal context. Some of you probably remember the Summer of Love. Smiles again. I remember the Summer of Punk. I was the only punk in Aberystwyth. I was dragged on a very rough part of South London. And in 1976, we had the famous heat wave, the famous drought in the UK. And this shows a global map, temperatures relative to those from 51 to 1980. The globe was 0.5 of a degree cooler then. And you notice that the UK stands out rather nicely. A very wiggly jet stream, which Hannah is a world expert on, and we'll be talking about that sometime this afternoon. Is this going to work? There we go. And in terms of my adult life, and I think this is the key thing, I'm 61 years old. That's my wife. I met in the first week of Freshers' Week. Put up with me for nearly 40 years, but I've had longer than 40 years. And when I was finishing my PhD, my favourite punk band is Clash. Woo! Thank you again. And there was a wonderful song, and it says, 1979, London's calling, the ice age is coming, the sun is zooming in, meltdown expected, the wheat is growing thin, engines stop running, I have no fear, because London is drowning, I live by the river. So when I was doing my PhD, the expectation was that the world was cooling. We were moving towards the next ice age. This is going to really annoy me. I'm going to have to go and stand the other side. That's why I might need my glasses. There we go. If we then fast forward to the summer of 2018, you notice that the... Edward, could I ask you a favour? Could you push the slides? Is that all right? Very nice when I put the senior colleague and help me with this. I didn't expect you to sit down. I didn't expect this. This is the summer of 2018. Again, a series of records were wrote. These are recorded temperature record. You notice that most of the planet has gone red, 0.78 degrees. Next slide, please, Edward. And this is the context in terms of me, and this is the context in terms of my grandchildren. You've got Betty and Edith, Tanner sisters as they're known as. And what we've got on the left-hand side here is a wonderful diagram produced by Ed Hawkins of Reading University, which basically shows the changes in temperature from 1901 through to 2018. The hotter temperatures shown in red. That's when I was born. These are when my granddaughters were born. So in less than 40 years, next slide please, Edward. Less than 40 years, this is what we've moved through in my lifetime. And as someone who's worked for nearly over 40 years on climate change impacts on the Earth system, I didn't expect to live through arguably one of the most interesting periods. I know there's a Chinese proverb related to that, but I didn't want to live through that period, but I am, and many of you are as well. That is the climate change projections, a hockey stick within a hockey stick. What of those are, I'm not quite sure. And the other thing which is key as well is that the massive increase in world population. And it's a climate crisis, and it's a planetary crisis as well. And I'll try to show, how these things are interlinked. Apologies again, I can't do this through mime or dance or whatever, although I do give art science presentations. My wife was a printmaker, so I have done some of these things. This is a classic, inverted commas, academic lecture. But I think it's important to give you the evidence base. I have worked on this for 40 years. I have worked on this globally, and I've got several of my undergraduates in here, and they can vouch for whether we're making a difference. 5 components. I'm going to introduce you to the river systems dynamics in the Earth system. Obviously, rivers and water is the lifeblood of our society. 2 billion people in the world are going to be challenged very quickly indeed in terms of water resources. Not just in terms of water quality, not just water quantity, but water quality as well. And I'm going to come back to that towards the end. And I will, and I've rehearsed this with Bishop David, I've got a couple of contentious slides towards the end in terms of where I think institutional religion can make a difference in terms of these things, and maybe that will be something we can discuss later. I'll give you a heads up in terms of what we call rivers of civilisation, the history behind environmental change. We're not the first society globally to be challenged by climate change, but actually the things we're dealing with now are genuinely unprecedented in terms of their scale and complexity. Okay, thank you. I'll talk about rivers of the Anthropocene, the period we're living through at the moment, and human actions are becoming increasingly more important in terms of climate change. And then the last 2 points deal with issues related to contamination. We did a lot of work within Lincoln University, particularly in the centre, in terms of mining-related contamination, fundamental component of the system, and I'll have some pointers, I think, in terms of what we might need to do. This is very much a global north and northern hemisphere perspective. I say I do work globally, and I've tried to choose things which I think had generic relevance. But obviously some of those are very much place-based. This is not a plug. I presume that I know that these lectures are being recorded. I hope that they're going to be looked after and can be put on a web base or whatever. So if you are interested in this stuff, this is the evidence base as I understand it. And one of my key roles as head of the School of Geography at the University of Lincoln is in terms of education. So this is the stuff which is peer-reviewed, looked at globally, and this is what we actually need to base our understanding on. Next slide, please, Edward. I've worked on river systems for about 40 years, and the first one I worked on was the Afon Ystwyth, River Ystwyth in Wales. As I say, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not Welsh, although my grandmother was a Jones. And this is where I did my PhD, and this is where we actually had our first house. The key thing about river systems, particularly alluvial rivers, is that if you change the magnitude and frequency of the floods, they change their morphology, they change their dimensions. And they are arguably one of the most sensitive parts of the Earth system in terms of environmental change. Next slide over. Another type of rivers, the second major type of rivers, are bedrock rivers. These are just an example of those I've worked with in the American Southwest, bedrock canyons, and they preserve in little crevices like these exquisite flood deposits, which are actually colour-coded in terms of which tributary system they came in. So we have alluvial rivers, we have bedrock rivers. And I know from working in New Zealand, there are both in those type of environments. And the reason to understand that is in terms of understanding flood risk, and I'll show you in a second of how short our instrumental records are, we need to understand river dynamics, both in terms of understanding flood risk, but also the relationship to contamination and to water-related disease. Next slide over. Other components related to river systems is the role of land use cover, fundamental in terms of sediment supply, fundamental in terms of water quality. And I think you can learn some lessons from the past, but what I want to try and do in part of this presentation is actually show the deep time element in terms of the transformation of our planet. This is an old plot. Very good friend of mine, Leszek Starkle, actually leader of the Solidarity group in Poland many years ago. A brilliant Polish river scientist. He basically illustrated the trajectory of land use change in terms of the development of cultivation, which goes back nearly 10,000 years, the major impacts of grazing, and the trajectories associated with it. Next slide, please, Edward. Obviously, as we move forward to the present, we have massive deforestation, which actually extends over many biomes in the world, and then more recently, intense cultivation. If you can't see the slide on the top, people have actually cut out SOS in a deforested part of the landscape, which I thought was a wonderful metaphor in terms of the challenges we are facing. Next slide, please, Edward. In terms of land use and land use histories provides the template to understand river dynamics, water quality, sediment quality, soil fertility within and on our planet. And we shouldn't forget that in terms of many parts of the world, we've got ancient agriculture over much of the Southwest Asia, much of the Nile Valley, much of Western Europe, which goes back, and also obviously in terms of India, Indian subcontinent and China, back at least 6,000 or 7,000 years. Next slide, please, Edward. We then have the major drylands in the globe, which in the past and in present are probably, with the exception of the polar regions, experiencing the most change in terms of water resources. Next slide, please, Edward. And then we have regions which have been massively changed over the last couple of centuries, particularly as a consequence of European colonisation, including many places in the Pacific Ocean, including New Zealand and obviously the major islands. Next slide, please. And next. The other component in terms of river systems is climate change and the regional controls of that. And that's something that we really need to understand in terms of changes in water resources. This is a diagram which shows the world's largest rivers. I won't go through them by name. On the right-hand side, it shows the major hydroclimate mode domains. So shown in purple are the major monsoon areas of the planet, areas like the affected by the Siberian High, the North Atlantic Oscillation, and ENSO. This is the way that climate change, global anthropogenic warming, will be played out. And these have very, very strong regional expressions. Next slide, please. And probably the best known, certainly for those in terms of the southern hemisphere, is ENSO, El Niño Southern Oscillation, and also the Indian Ocean Dipole. So this is the way that climate change has been played out at a regional scale. And in terms of all the modelling that we do, unless we capture these regional variabilities, we won't be able to help people on the ground. And that is a major change, a major challenge, particularly when we're dealing with major non-stationarity in our climate systems, which makes them very difficult to predict, even into the near future, let alone 100 years into the future beyond that. Next slide, please, Edward. And this is just a table just to illustrate, in terms of the major rivers, large rivers in the world, and the Lincoln Centre for Water and Planetary Health, with one of a series of programs I'm going to do, its major focus is on the largest rivers on the planet. And I just wanted to illustrate in this, in terms of how many of them, particularly in terms of the global south, are influenced by ENSO, and also particularly by the monsoon. Next slide, please. Taking that material together, understanding climate histories, understanding land use change, understanding the way that rivers respond in an incredibly sensitive way to changes in sediment supply and runoff, you can come up with a diagram like this. And what you end up with, and this is a slightly perhaps unhelpful description, is unhealthy and unsafe rivers. We have unexpected changes in flow regimes, floods, droughts, hazardous inputs in terms of pollutants, and I'll come back to this later on. Changes in the, and I'll put it in inverted commas, the normal, what we would expect in terms of a natural river system. Those produce changes in morphology, and I'll touch on this to some degree. We do a lot of work in terms of the hydrological controls of malaria, particularly in terms of sub-Saharan Africa. We don't understand water, not so much temperature control. We don't understand water movement. You can't control many of the waterborne diseases. Next slide, please. Okay, and the next slide. Winston Churchill quote: "The longer you look back, the further you can look forward." I think there is some value in that, in terms of appreciating that societies over millennia have been challenged by environmental change. However, in terms of what we will be dealing with in the next 10 to 50 years, I think these are salutary lessons, but they do not give us a template in terms of the way that we need to go forward. Next slide, please. My undergraduates in the audience, I can see Bart, a lot of people as well. I teach a first-year course called Building the Earth. And I explained to my brilliant foundational undergraduates the importance of environmental change in terms of Earth history and the way that societies and civilizations have actually adjusted to it. So in terms of the famous river civilizations on the planet, we've got obviously Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and also China. Next slide, please, Edward. But there are many others which were arguably more important in terms of our planetary history, in terms of scientific development, that we don't, or we know very little about. And the demise of those were in part, a major part, related to environmental change. I don't use the word collapse. The reason I don't use the word collapse, because in many of these pre-industrial societies, actually the move away from civilization might have been a good thing for them, particularly if you were living under despotic regimes in Mesopotamia or Egypt or even parts of China. So actually in terms of the agrarian regimes, which were very important in terms of those effectively despotic states, those sorts of societies collapse might have been a good thing in terms of the general population, in terms of diversity. This is one I've been working on for many years. It's largely unknown outside of much of the former Soviet Union. This is the Lost River civilizations of Central Asia, which in terms of the extent, they were focused on the Oxus and also on the Amadara River. Next slide please, Edward. Without reading the top bullet point, why did Alexander the Great stop at the Euphrates River, which is just here? Why did he stop at that point? Why didn't he bother to go any further? It was the edge, it was the end of the civilized world. Strabo described it as the land of 1,000 cities. It was the birthplace of Zoroaster. And, most importantly as well, it was the centre of the medieval Islamic Enlightenment, significantly predating the Enlightenment in terms of Europe. Next slide, please. This is Ottra. What is the significance of Ottra? This city and its demise was a turning point in world history. Does anyone know why? You should. This is the major fortifications, huge site. It's located in the Ottra Oasis, a massive canal system, actually which the Soviets reused, actually the Russian Federation, Russian Empire reused in the 1880s. Okay, the answer is Genghis Khan. Short story, I'll tell it very quickly. And there is significance to this, is in terms of societies where you've got the juxtaposition of climate change. I could have put something very cheeky on this, but my wife persuaded me not to. When we've got leaders, inverted commas, in terms of global societies. The news was very disappointing this morning. Nothing to do with Brexit, but actually in terms of the weaponisation of space, it seems. So you get where I'm going to. Genghis Khan, he sent a caravan to Ottra, and rather foolishly, the ruler of Ottra killed everyone in that caravan, which is not a very good thing to do if that caravan was owned by Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan at that time, this is 1218, was thinking about actually expanding it into southern China. And on the basis of that slight, I would use a very rude Peckham word here, but I won't. On the basis of that slight, said, no, I'm going west. I'm going to go and teach these people a lesson. And as a consequence of that, the Persian Empire fell. The former kingdom of Rus was destroyed, and the world was shifted literally on its axis. And this part of the world never recovered. So, without labouring the point, you do get, on many occasions, and I've just listed at the bottom here, these are our various river civilizations. These arrows here show various turning points, each related to climate change. And this was in a pre-industrial, a more limited, connected global environment. So history won't repeat itself, but unfortunately in terms of the complexity of our environment, in terms of the weaponization of our environments, I am fearful at best. Next slide, please, Edward. Okay. There were other river civilizations. Next slide, please, Edward. Particularly in West Africa, the very famous site of Timbuktu, Niger. Again, those have a history of climate change and also in the past and more recently in terms of conflict, in part related to religious difficulties. Next slide, please. We have the pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas, the Mississippian culture, which had to reorganize itself in 1350, before Columbus arrived. They had to do it as a consequence of climate change. Next slide, please. We've got the American Southwest. Wonderful Hohocan. This is the site of Phoenix Airport. These canal systems here were left by the Hohocan in the late 1300s. And obviously, next slide please, we've got the pre-Columbian civilizations of South America, where as a consequence of the introduction of germs, disease by the Europeans associated with Columbus, these societies were completely decimated. In fact, beyond that, there's a reduction probably in terms of the Americas, a population of 60 million, probably more populated than Europe. And within a period of probably 50 years, 100 years at the most, as a consequence of a pathogen wave reduced to probably 6 million. So disease is linked as well. Looking at your faces now, I'm not really cheering any of you up in this. It gets a little bit better. But there is a serious context to these things, and each of these societies were challenged, had to reconfigure in different ways. Next slide. And just to make that point, in terms of those in the Americas, a major tipping point was in actually the 1300s or 1350s, probably associated also with a very strong period of ensoforcing, very extreme mega droughts in the 1300s and 1350s. So this predated Columbus's colonization and the colonial developments in that region. Next slide, please. Okay. Let's shift it into the present, so to speak. Let's actually look, and I'm going to take a UK, a local example in terms of issues related to flooding, to disaster management, and then I'm going to make links in terms of an unexpected connection in terms of contamination and disease. So this is very much a counterpoint to what our wonderful Linesian guests have presented. Next slide, please. In terms of the UK, beginning around about the autumn 2000, we've had a series of exceptional flood events. And that really continues through to the present day. And the word which is used in these contexts is that these floods are unprecedented. They are not. Next slide, please. I'll explain in a second. This is very local. This is River Steeping, Wainfleet All Saints, Lincolnshire, June of this year. This is the river system here, the embankments of Durst. This is the properties that were flooded. But the key thing to notice about these systems, and this applies to many of the river systems, particularly in the global north, but also in the global south, many of them are humanly constructed. this is a completely artificial river landscape. And it is made sensitive, more sensitive to climate change because of the drainage that took place, because of the peak compaction, because of the embankments that were built. And actually, Wainfleet All Saints is built on a small ridge, and that ridge is actually built up of old salt deposits, because this was a very important area in terms of the medieval and also the Roman period in terms of salt production in the region. So this is a completely human construct. So we see in the local press, unprecedented. Next slide, please, Edward. This is where records become important. In the UK, we've only got, on average, 41 years of river flow data. Next slide, Edward. And if you look across the globe, the shortest record is Belarus, the longest is Germany. Many of these instrumental records go back no more than 40 or 50 years. So when these floods are described, same in New Zealand, when these are described as unprecedented, they are based on the instrumental record. So one of the reasons for me showing you the more deep time aspects in terms of society is these floods are not unprecedented. Many of the droughts we're seeing at the moment are not unprecedented. And the significance of that is that things are only going to get much, much worse. And I can see that in terms of Polynesia, you are seeing the first impacts of anthropogenic climate change. I would be a little bit contentious, me and Edward have talked about when the Anthropocene began in the globe. I jokingly said, I think to Edward, I think it was 2012, because that's when we had a big change in terms of the Northern Hemisphere jet stream as a consequence of Arctic amplification, as a consequence of the decreased demise of the Arctic ice sheet. And that's when we really started to see for the first time climate weirding in a real way. So, next slide please, Edward. If you actually look at our gauged records, and I can show you diagrams like this from around the planet. This is the River Severn, and in terms of that record there, well, there's a cycle perhaps, but no trend. Next slide please, Edward. This takes us back a little bit longer. Again, this is on the River Severn. There are records, historical records, where people have marked the height of floods on bridges, on stones, and so on. If you actually look at this record, this is flood magnitude here, going back to the late 18th century. Would you say that flood magnitude is increasing? No. I'm not a climate denier. I've worked in climate change all my life. I'm a climate and environmental realist. That is, next slide please, Edward. And actually, if you take the UK as a whole, these are flood-rich and flood-poor periods based on the gauge records. And again, there really isn't much of a trend when you look at it in that way. Next slide please, Edward. And actually, when you look at the last IPC report, one of the largest uncertainties in terms of what's going to happen in the future, I won't read this stuff to you, but you can look at it at your leisure, is the reliance on these gauged records. And the problems that we have in the most parts of the planet doesn't have instrumental sequences that we can actually use. Next slide. There are ways around this, and I think this is going to become increasingly important as our infrastructure, and I'll show you an extreme form of infrastructure in a second, becomes ever more of a threat in terms of these so-called unprecedented floods. We need to extend our flood records. We actually have, in terms of river catchments, this is a schematic diagram from the headwaters to the sea, we have in various parts of the landscape floodplain archives, which record past major floods, which we can date. And we can extend our flood records, in some cases, going back thousands of years, which we need in terms of understanding the impact of ongoing climate change and also ongoing language change. I'll just whiz through these. Next slide, please, Edward. These are somewhat idiosyncratic, but actually these methodologies have been used all around the world, in South America, New Zealand. They were inadvertently pioneered by an undergraduate of mine in the mid-1980s. We measured the size of lichens. You know what lichens are? Grows in stones. We go to graveyards. We measure the rate at which these lichens grow. And in terms of these pictures here, Shawbeck, very few people know this. This is in Yorkshire Dales. It's the same place that was affected by flooding a month ago. We had a huge flood in 1986. This area recovered in 1996. And these boulders we can date using lichenometry. Next slide, please, Edward. In terms of the unprecedented nature of these recent floods, what we've been able to do in terms of British uplands is extend the flood record back 200, 300, 400 years. We've done exactly the same exercise in terms of South America, exactly the same exercise in many parts of the Mediterranean, and the same thing's been done in the US. Without going into the details, this is a diagram showing flood frequency. There's an issue in terms of when these records begin, because it depends on the longevity of these particular lichens. But in terms of flood frequency, you'll notice that in England and Wales, that the early part of the 20th century, the mid part of the 19th century, particularly the late part of the 18th century, floods were much more frequent. And these were floods that which removed the boulders the size of a large table. Next slide, please. Flood magnitude. Just take the bottom one here. This is Yorkshire Dales, going back to nearly 1600. Our politicians, even some of our flood managers, saying there's never been bigger floods, never been as bad as this. But what this shows is that going back to 1600, there were much larger flood events. And actually the period of gauging, the mid and late 20th century, was very unusual. It was actually very benign in terms of our flood records. And that's what we're using in most parts of the globe in terms of flood prediction. Some of you are smiling now, so perhaps the penny is dropping. The key thing to notice here is that in the 2000s, in the 21st century, we are starting to see, in some environments, an uptick in terms of flood magnitude. But we're not getting close to what we saw in earlier parts of the 18th and 19th century. Next slide, please, Edward. Keep going. The significance of this is that in terms of the conventional modelling, statistical modelling, that's done in terms of, for instance, a small catchment, which is important in terms of water resources and reservoir protection. The estimated discharges using extrapolation of these records is around about 5 cubic metres per second in terms of a 1% 100-year flood. Using our methods, we get values 200% larger than this. Next slide, please. And again, recently, for those in the UK, we saw the near failure of the Whaley Bridge Dam, constructed in the late 18th century. Basically, in terms of the flood records there, not appropriate in terms of flood risk. Next slide. The poignancy of this is that, I use this word carefully, for my sins. I'm an advisor for the nuclear industry, actually employed by the UK government, both poacher and gamekeeper. This is Hinkley Point C. And before we intervened, I can't say too much, but I had to sign the official secrets. Before we intervened, what was going to be used was the recorded, resampled Environment Agency records, which go back 50 years, of trying to understand not a 1 in 10,000 event, sorry, not a 1 in 100 year event, 1%, but a 1 in 10,000. So you realise there's something as significant as this. If it was taken out by either a major storm or a major flood, we need to get these things right. Next slide, please. Okay. If I haven't cheered you up already, this will probably push you over the edge before lunch. And it is food related. Next slide, please, everybody. Following the big floods in the UK in 2000, some of you probably remember John Prescott, who can forget him. There was an extraordinary event on the Yorkshire Roads, northern England, city of York is located there. And in terms of geographic change, in terms of landscape change, very little happened. We got a major grant from the UK government to actually look at the impacts in terms of river systems. And nothing really happened. As an afterthought, we thought, let's sample the sediments deposited by this particular flood, because we were interested in working out within the catchment where the sediment was coming from. It's got a long history of mining. Much to our absolute amazement, and there's just a couple of figures you need to remember. This is a plot showing metal concentrations. This is lead. 10,000 parts per million. 10,000 parts per million is 1% by weight lead. It's just about high enough in terms of commercial mining purposes. This is an area affected by historical mining. And these, shown in blue, are samples taken down the swale system. This limit here, the UK, 1,000 ppm, is in terms of the remediation of brownfield sites in UK cities. And you can see in some instances we had concentrations 10,000, 12,000 parts per million. Contaminated material, this is historically polluted, this material has been reworked and deposited on our floodplains. Next slide. We were told by the UK vet at the time of the millennium floods, we got our decimal points in the wrong place. I smiled. I said, yes, probably I've underestimated it. It couldn't be related to historic mining, it must be atmospheric contamination. No, it's not. We give you isotope studies to demonstrate that's not the case. And it was swept under the carpet until 2012. My former institution, I still live partly in Wales, in Aberystwyth, beautiful part of the country, where I do my rowing. And we had a major flood. By convenience, it occurred over the college farm. And Aberystwyth is world famous in terms of Mass University. It was an integral part in terms of setting up the agricultural department at Mass University, particularly the grass industry. And there was a very famous cattle, Welsh blacks within the college. Again, to give you a flavour, these are, flavour's perhaps the wrong word, to give you an insight in terms of contamination levels. These circles here are where we took flood sediments after 12,012 event, and we are getting, in this system here, where the college farm is located, concentrations in excess of 30,000 ppm, at 3% by weight lead. And you can see this is 10 kilometres, it's not an insignificant area. This is the college farm. These are metal concentrations up to 7,000 ppm deposited on these experimental plots. Next slide, please. The college director, 3 months later, I do a lot of work for the media. And I was on television as usual with these things. And I actually said in July 2012, the big problem is going to be in terms of environmental contamination. Because I actually work for the Welsh Government as well, I was told off. But I said, I'm an academic, I'm speaking truth. 3 months later, the director of the college farms phoned me up and he said a series of rude words along the lines that I was correct. And what had happened is that 20 of the cattle had died. They had been fed contaminated silage. And these are some of the blood lead concentrations associated with. Next slide. That's a very parochial, a very place-based story. But just to end on, I want to upscale this. And this is when it becomes a little bit frightening and a little bit pertinent in terms of the climate and planetary crises, because they come together. I've got a wonderful team of people I work with. None of them actually, in terms of my group, are here today, but I should pick out a particular Amo and Mangala, my two Indian postdocs, who have been an integral part in terms of developing, as you'll see in a second, a global database of the impacts of metal mining. In the UK, we've got historical issues. We've got a legacy effect. And what we've done, and I won't bore you with details, it's finished, it will be submitted to Nature next week. I've got to be a bit cautious about this. I realise the press are here, so I can talk about some of the details of this, but the first time, other than inaugural, I'm giving some of the details, a little bit more than last time. Well, what we've done for the globe is mapped out, these are the various mines in the UK. You can see a lot of it is red. We were the first, for our sins, the first industrial nation. We're still paying for that in many ways. And what we mapped out are the contaminated catchments. And because with the ability of things like GIS, remote sensing, these wonderful global databases, fantastic postdocs who can manipulate data, as long as I can understand it, in a wonderful way, and we can overlap these things. We can see how many people live on these floodplains. We can see how many sheep or cattle, how much is like in the food chain. In the UK alone, 600,000 people live on metal-contaminated floodplains. Next slide, please. If we scale this up again, there's the little old UK. There is a global map that's been produced as part of this project. We estimated, and this is an underestimate, that 31.5 million people worldwide live on contaminated floodplains. They're growing, they're irrigating, they're eating contaminated material. In terms, I'm going to end in a second, the other thing which is equally in the news, and I'll show this in a second of relevance for the Anglican Church, in terms of the investments, is the impact of tailings dam failures, which we know about. And again, inadvertently, I've worked in tailings dam failures for about 20 years. In Romania, Hungary, South America, it goes on. By contrast, and this is not to downscale it, only 200,000 people worldwide are affected by tailings dam failures, which is 2 orders of magnitude lower than those affected by either current or legacy mining. The other significant thing, and this is an ongoing project we've got in the Ganga, GCRF funded, and also work that I do in sub-Saharan Africa and malaria. The other bit of bad news is that in terms of micro-antibiotic resistance and mosquito insecticide tolerance, you increase that by increasing metal pollution. So actually these things are running together. Next slide, please. This is in part what the Anglican Church are doing and can do. I'm going to end on the second slide. This is happening at the moment. I will be contacting the individuals end of this week. They're basically looking at the investment. They've contacted 600 major mines around the world. And they're asking them in terms of tailings dam safety, of how well things are looked after. I think that's a very important step. But the big thing that we are missing is the legacy and current metal mining impacts. I was watching the Channel 4 news last night. Amazonia is burning. But at the end, they were talking about artisanal gold mining. And one of the reasons that Amazonia is burning is in part as a consequence of expansion of farming, but also significantly in part in terms of artisanal gold mining. That releases mercury, that releases cyanide. Next slide, please. That's 4 more slides. The future. Education. Very proud, that's our first year at the University of Lincoln School of Geography, founded in 2016. And again, I'm not going to read the stuff out there, but I think in terms of our universities and schools, we've got to start there. Next slide, please. I think, and I've tried to illustrate in a perhaps a rather perverse way, that actually understanding and knowing the evidence is fundamentally important in terms of decision making we make on the ground. Because actually, in terms of my academic life, and I've worked in most parts of, I think I've worked in all the inhabited continents, I've seen huge wastes of money, certainly in terms related to soil conservation, certainly related to desertification, which people don't understand. They're not doing it deliberately, they don't understand the evidence base. So that is something that as an academic, we really must take more active steps. Next slide, please. And engagement. This is my Wanganui links. This wonderful Wanganui iwi proverb, I am the river is me. And I realised that in terms of working with that community, and I'm still working with that community, I've lived up this project, but actually of the designation, I think the Wanganui, even before the Ganga, was the first river in the world which was actually given a legal basis, legal protection. And it came from an understanding, a Maori Polynesian understanding of the interconnectedness, the essential interconnectedness between us and the natural, inverted commas, environment. Next slide. And this will be the last slide, probably my most contentious or not. I was in Zambia about a month ago, and this is not taken from the web. We are looking at a project on the Zambezi, looking at the impact of climate change and flooding on malaria. And this is one of the craft, God's first water transport, the best you can trust, which I thought was wonderful. But the serious point, I think in terms, and I think one of the important reasons for this meeting, is that organised institutional religion, as I'm suggesting, has an essential role in terms of education, evidence, and the public engagement. But just to maybe promote debate, these are the stocks and bonds held by a random selection of institutional religions around the planet. Church of England holds 8 billion in terms of stocks and bonds. Catholic Church, 147 billion. Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, 25 billion. You are, some of you, major global players that rival Microsoft, that rival Apple, that rival many of the major multinational companies globally. I'm not a person of faith, but I think in terms of nudging the planet, this might be the way to go. And if you do, you've got my support.
learning from them. So you've done that superbly for us. I asked Mark during the interval whether I was going to be able to understand it or not. I did, and that was really, really helpful. So, huge thank you, but I want to give people time to, rather than listen to me spout on, I want to give people time to ask questions, make comments. So, we've got about 10 minutes, I think, Jason? So, who wants to go first? Who's going to grab the mic? Oh, always on the other side.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. Phenomenal. The figures coming out. We've got to grow as much food in the next 50 years than we've grown in the previous 500,
Yeah.
with a third less fresh water.
Yeah.
Is that correct? And how can we begin to mitigate that loss of fresh water running off the land, taking soil and goodness? 1 billion people, is it correct? Are the invisible hunger because of the micronutrients that have been lost across the planet? So we've got a very short time frame to put some of this right, and it needs massive strategic political savvy and the Church of England with all that investment to huge influence.
What I'm going to say now is my own belief, okay? So that this is me as a person, not representing University of Lincoln or whatever. I think we've run out of time.
Yeah.
We've got to adapt. And I could get actually quite emotional about that. And I think the key thing is, if you look at the speed, and I'm someone who's worked for decades on climate change impacts on river systems. And I never thought it was going to become vogue or whatever. It's quite ironic in many respects. Well, what strikes me, and Edward is a broad expert on these things, what strikes me is that in terms of the relationship in terms of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane, if you look at the relationship in terms of Arctic amplification, if you actually look at the now linear relationship between global temperature is a very difficult thing to measure. It's just racking up, and actually it's accelerating. And I 35 years ago, when I first started lecturing to my undergraduates on what was called modest climate change, it was sort of 1 or 1.5 degrees had made a big influence in terms of river systems over the last 10,000 years. I didn't realise 35 years later that I would actually be living through a period of climate change which exceeded that. So it's adaptation. And the science is settled. We don't need to, we've actually got to, we had the Marshall Plan in terms of after the Second World War. We need something more than that. And it's got, anyway, it's got, I don't, that's not an answer to your question, but I think there is the willingness, there is the resource in terms of intellectual calibre. I've never voted in my life. No. I'm a student of politics. I'm not a person of faith. But I've a profound interest in the history of religion. And the reason for both of those, stepping out of both of those, I've never been convinced that maybe this meeting will change in terms of organised religion, or our politicians, I would say a very rude phrase here, but I won't, had the impeccable to say something else. But it has to change. And there is the capability, there's the willingness, the expertise, but we've got to stop mucking around. But yes, I've got a planet which is not appropriate.
Hi, I'm a neutral civil servant, should we start off there? I work part-time for the Environment Agency in Flood Risk Management, so just to make friends with you, I'm also a geographer from ABBA, so there we go.
Oh,
Good. So, yeah, I
Did I teach you?
No, I did my postgrad there.
All right. Okay.
So in the Environment Agency, we do a lot of work to help communities understand the risk they're facing, fluvial and coastal, which I think links back to this morning's presentations. Sometimes they're reluctant because they haven't experienced, it's unprecedented within their lifetime, should we say, just to bring that phrase back into it. So they're sometimes reluctant to take action because of that lack of understanding of the concept of risk, I think. So how do you think we can best engage people with the realities of the risks that they're facing and the impacts? And I suppose that's broader than flood risk management, really.
It is. And thank you. It's a well-placed question. With my wife, who's an artist, printmaker, the last 10 years we've been involved in projects around the planet looking at community engagements, particularly in terms of post-disaster, particularly flood-related incidents. And actually, we just started in Lincoln a project called My River, which relates to the River Witham. And what we do in those is something called a walk and talk. And I'm a physical geographer, I'm a geomorphologist. If I have any expertise, I understand the landscape. So drop me anywhere on the planet, not my ice cap, thank you, or the sea. But I can explain to you, I understand the way that things are configured. And I realise that in terms of communities, that you need to go into them and explain to them on the ground. This is don't build on a floodplain. That's the first. And they say, well, where does the floodplain stop and start? The river's never moved. It has. So you have to lead people through that. And because we've lost that, certainly in the UK at least, we've lost the connectedness with our natural. We don't really have a natural, it's another thing. We've lost the connection with our river systems. I think it's been a travesty in terms of, since 2000, something like, I think 100,000 new homes have been built on floodplains. And I advised the Welsh, it's not just building floodplains, it's the problem in terms of you then have to enhance the infrastructure as well. So you can flood-proof a house, but do you live on an island? So to sort of answer your question, it does have to go beyond river science. It has to go in terms of connection with place, mythology, poetry, artistic representation, and so on. However, and this is not in any way to denigrate, I think the artwork associated with comedy is fantastic, but I have a dark side to these things. And I think it's wonderful in terms of showing an idealised sort of version of what things could be, maybe based on sort of fairy tales and myths. But for me, if you looked at the images, the photographic images that came as a result of some of the major hurricanes, with pictures, unfortunately, of dead people, that makes a difference. So in terms of teaching our children or grandchildren, I read my granddaughter's fairy stories. I don't frighten them now, but I think there's a reality, and it's complex, but it's not necessarily complicated. So, anyway.
Excuse me. Sorry.
Right,
Hi.
Hi.
One of the concerns that a lot of people have been having about water resources in particular is its potential to start social conflict. So as water resources start to dwindle and the associated risks go on with that, there's a chance it might lead to civil conflicts within states or across states. But the other side is that water treaties concerning water resources and the sharing of that have actually been some of the most resilient in history. So is there a chance that as water dwindles, political solidarity might start to increase and people might start to cooperate more as water resources start to dwindle and it starts to become more of a problem. So could it have a positive
That's a
effect?
very interesting question. I can give you two specific examples of two river systems, big river systems I've worked on. I worked on the Danube for many years and also the Nile. Danube is the most transnational river on the planet. And it's been a great success in terms of allocating water resources, with the exception of the major tailings dam failure in 2000 by Mari, but that's a success. I worked with the British Museum since the mid-1990s in Sudan, not looking at water resources, but actually looking at the way that climate change affects the kingdom which were the rivals to the Egyptians, the Kerma, the Nubians. And the Nile is perhaps not a great example. At the moment, with Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan itself, building reservoirs, there are problems there as well. So I think, yes, there may be examples where these systems are relatively robust, but they've only been tested so far. And I think that is the issue. So without sending us to lunch in a thoroughly pressed mood, because I think, you know, people can make a difference, but we've got to act now. What we're going to see will be unprecedented, but we haven't seen it yet. And that's what worries me. And when you do see genuinely the unprecedented, not just in terms of the instrumental, but actually in terms of the longer term records, you've got systems which are locked in by infrastructure, locked in by dams, locked in by engineering. They won't be able to cope. And the Wainfleet, the local example, is a classic example. It was a fairly big rainstorm. But actually, if you had no infrastructure there, no embankments, no peak compaction, so what? But as a consequence of all of those, damage was done. So actually, we made a problem for ourselves because there are, 7.5 billion of us on the planet. Got 10 billion on the planet who want to have a lower middle class, upper class lifestyle as I've enjoyed from working class background. Those things to me just can't really add up or be sustained. I see a hand over there just been outside London. No, it's not there, sorry. I will come back. We could take that lunch. Sorry.
Well, you're not a voter and you're not a communicant.
No.
But you clearly developed a passion that could bring tears to your eyes. And for 40 years since you've been doing this.
Yeah.
I think we need lots of people with beautiful minds like yours doing more of this. So what started you on this path?
My dad.
Tell us about that.
He's still alive, he's in his late 80s. He was a fanatical rock climber. I'm scared of heights. I'm a better footballer than he is. But no, he took me from South London to Mid Wales, the seascapes, and got me into the landscapes. And Peckham is an iconic South London, from the accent, suburb, which has been gentrified. It's quite extraordinary when you go back there now. But it was a very rough, tough. I was lucky in that it wouldn't happen now. I'm a public school boy. I went to a private school, but this was paid for by the local authorities. I won't tell you which school I went to. So I was given that opportunity. I was given an opportunity by my father. And I love rivers. I want to understand them. So in terms of, and I can see some of my undergraduates here, what I try to infuse in them is, don't think of where you want to be in 40 years' time. Do what you love. If inadvertently, by doing that, you can make a difference, then as long as you're, I'll use a rubric, you must never bullshit with these things. Ever. And that's that when someone asks me a question, if I don't understand it, so it's a very interesting question, I can't answer it at the moment, I'll go back and think of it. So there is a responsibility as someone like me as a senior academic in terms of making sure that we do speak truth to power. And I've done that all my work in life. It's just in terms of the way that we can move these things forward. And it was a revelation to me, epiphany perhaps, that I realised that in terms of actually moving forward, it could be through institutional religion globally. Because obviously what I haven't included that is the Islamic, Hindu. And these are the major players in the world, and if nothing else, they can, I can't think of a better phrase, they can pull on the heartstrings, they can pull on they can raise these ethical issues and say we should do things differently. But it's got to happen now. And I think, say, the science is settled. Unfortunately, I don't really believe in sustainability anymore. I'm not even sure I believe in resilience, which is depressing. It depends where you are on the planet. If you are at the front line, then, yeah. But actually, in terms when I work in India and China, when you've got 2.5 billion people, I don't think we've got anyone here from India or China, the US subcontinent here. In terms of nudging things forward, unless we involve those societies, we're going absolutely nowhere. And we've just started a big project in Uganda, and I was telling Bishop David of trying to get through Calcutta to go to one of our sampling sites. We're looking at antibiotic resistance. And you go through a mega city of 20 million people, and the realisation, you think, what the hell am I doing? So unless we change that, then I think this is a wonderful event. I think we will learn from it, but I am concerned of actually will it make a difference? And that's my, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mark. So we're now at lunch. Just to let you know that after lunch we've got some parallel sessions. During lunch, the marketplace stalls will also be doing some short announcements from about 1:45 onwards. But when we come back after lunch, which will be 2:15, if you wish, you have a choice of 3 parallel sessions. Dr. Sheila Andrus will be in this room here. That's about sustainability and for climate action and advocacy. Rebecca Forster from this university will be immediately opposite, almost, in the Cargill Lecture Theatre. So she will be talking about the university's ambitions for a zero-carbon campus. Dr. Sarah Hemstock and Dr. Mark Charlesworth will be in the Co-op Lecture Theatre just next to the Cargill. And they'll be talking about climate change in the role of education. Just to also remind you that we've also got on the mezzanine level upstairs, level 1, we've got some world-class artwork displays and reflection boards we'll be using later. Jason, do you want to add anything? Thank you very much. See you all hopefully after lunch.